and this is John. I'm up in Portrane, County Dublin, looking down onto Portrane Beach, and I'm inside the gates of St. Ida's burial ground. It's the burial ground for the asylum in Portrane, which was started as a lunatic asylum, then became an asylum and I suppose mental health hospital. And this whole area here is all graves. It's one of the bigger asylum graveyards in the country, and if you look at it on Google Earth, what you'll see is lots of individual graves showing up. You can see it's just been cut. It's looking in fabulous condition, and it's the first of these institutional burial grounds that these asylum burial grounds that I started to get my eye in, and I tried to come to visit Portrane a couple of years ago and it didn't work out. I got called away, so this is actually my first time coming in here, and the place it's really kept very well. And some of what I've been looking at in terms of the famine graves and identifying single famine graves and workhouse graves is based on, I think, what we can learn from these larger institutional burial grounds, like here in St. Ida's. What we're looking at here in this row of graves is, again, I'm trying to find how to draw on the screen. I can't remember how to do it. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if we draw there's a grave. And there's another one, and one there. All those hollows all along there are all graves. The row of graves there. That's a mess. How many can I see here? There's one right in front. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I can measure 10 in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So that's 10 grave hollows in 20 paces, which is roughly 20 meters. And you can see this is what I was taught by a former grave digger from Belfast. He says when they dig their graves in a cemetery, the grave itself might be 6 foot by 3 foot, but the actual grave space allotted for that single burial, he says, was something like 4.5 foot by 7 foot. And so there's usually a foot of a bank on either side of a grave that you dig. So there, that's the bank, that's the grave shaft, bank, grave shaft. So when you look across this landscape here, it's a mass of graves. I believe the practice here in Portrane was that any person who died in the institution, in the asylum, and wasn't claimed by their own people were buried by the institution. 1922 to 1989. In your charity, please pray for the residents of St. Ida's Hospital buried in this cemetery. May they rest in peace. In loving memory of Mary Casey Ruth, born 1892, died 1973. Okay. That if you were unclaimed by your family, then the institution, who almost became de facto family for a lot of their residents, then buried you. And you got a single grave to yourself. The grave had to be, you had to have at least 3 foot of soil over you. So I suspect what we're seeing here are single graves, used only once, 2 to 3 foot of soil capping a coffin. We know from other places that they got that there were tenders put out for the coffins to bury the residents. So you get a coffin, maybe a coffin plate, handles. They would do a minimum spec, and that the people then were buried there. I'm going to go that this hollow looks much bigger here. You can see that there. I'll try and draw him without making a mess this time. There, 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 there. Big and square. I think what you see sometimes is different people do the digging. I know in another graveyard I've looked at, it was actually the residents who dug the graves. It was considered, a lot of the asylums were kind of working farms. So working on the farm was considered part of your treatment. And I'm wondering, can we see different grave diggers at work here? Yeah. Deeper there, and now we're coming into, this is a more regular ground. So the lines of the lawnmower kind of catch the eye, but really what I'm looking at are these deep grassy bits. I won't go into it if I can help it. There, those hollows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's about 10 graves over that side. I'm on a sort of a path here. And can I do any kind of a count? What's standing out over here? Yeah, here we go. So 1, I don't know, 2, get my eye in, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's more there. 13, 14. Largely, mostly single graves. Pan across. I think there's a path there that I've just come down. And then the graves all in there. In some of the asylums they had cast iron crosses with numbers on that would have marked the number of the grave, and that would tally then with a burial register. And I've searched online to see was there any record of grave markers here in Portrane, but I haven't seen any. I expect there would be. Sometimes what happened is these asylum burial grounds may have been neglected for a while and vandalism may have taken place. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but sometimes that did happen. I've seen that in other cases. And that the grave markers were removed as part of that process. So I suppose the main thing I'm trying to point out here is that we were in Dublin last night and I found it very hard to see the graves from the workhouse. Whereas here, a single dedicated institutional cemetery, and you can see the grave hollows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's lots of them there. There's banks in between the graves, and then there's banks alongside the graves, and then there's banks at the head and the foot of the graves as well. So those kind of spaces are recognisable then. They're undug ground. The grave shafts are down in between. You'll see this in asylums and other institutional graveyards like this. I've seen a few in the UK. If you go into Google Earth or even into Google Maps, very often you'll see, when you look at the aerial, you'll see just this checkerboard effect, and you'll identify the graves. We looked at one recently in the Midlands in England, and it was just like this. There, all those deep hollows. There's a lady, a grave there. Okay, grave, grave, grave. There they all are. Less definite, but there. And if you think about the physicality of these graves, last night I was talking about there's an undulation there because of the banks at the foot and the head of the grave cuts. But if you think about the physicality, if these are single-use graves, I don't think they dug single-use graves to 6 feet. I suspect they gave them 4 feet. The coffin is a foot in thickness, and then 2 to 3 feet of soil over that. And then as the years go by and the coffin breaks down and the body inside breaks down, the grave then sinks below. And I'm wondering, can we identify a single-use institutional grave like this, where we're fairly certain that it only ever got one coffin, one person, was never really backfilled? And if we can kind of contrast those with pit graves that we get from the Famine area and from the various famine type graves that are out there, where there may have been multiple uses, or where maybe they stacked 2 or 3 coffins one on top of the other, do they sink more than a single coffin use? Is that something we can use to fingerprint these types of burials, so that we can interpret them without having to actually go and dig across them, which is, I'm a firm believer in rest in peace myself. So this is a fabulous place to come and visit, very well looked after, and we're counting how many rows do we get. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. There's somewhere up to 20 rows of burials, and there's something like 25 per row. So that'll give you some kind of quantification of what we might have here. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, just as an example of a 20th century institutional burial ground relating to asylum in this case, and single-use graves, and the whole field, the whole cemetery is filled with graves. It's a good one to keep in mind when we're looking at places like last night in the Shockland that are harder to read. Alright. Okay. I'll say over and out for now. If I can work out how to turn this thing off.